this is Dylan Moore with iRead TV, which you can find at iRead.tv. Today is part... Hello, this is Dylan Moore with iRead TV, which you can find at iRead.tv. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on intellectual self-defense entitled The Line of Reason. If you are listening now to part 2 and you have not yet listened to part 1, I really recommend that you go back and listen to part 1 first. There were ideas and terminology introduced in part 1 that if you're not familiar with, you're going to find that part 2 will be very difficult to understand. Additionally, I need to point out that the subject matter in part 2, it's a bit dry. I'm going to be doing my best to make it as entertaining and listenable as possible, but there's just no two ways about it. The subject matter in and of itself is very dry. Now, I'm not saying that to scare you off. I'm saying that because if at any point in part 2 you feel like that this is getting too dense and you might not be able to finish, don't feel bad stopping and going straight to part 3. There are core concepts in part 2 that are really invaluable to understanding intellectual self-defense and utilizing intellectual self-defense. But if I'm being honest, if you just listen to part 1 and part 3, you're still going to go home with a pretty potent intellectual self-defense arsenal. Now, one more thing I want to add before I get started is I really recommend that you do not listen to an audio-only version of part 2. The visuals here are going to be very, very, very helpful for you to follow along and understand what's going on. But if you do choose to listen to the audio-only version, I still will be making my best efforts to making it understandable to those listening to an audio-only version. So with all that said, let's get started. All right, let's get into part 2 of this intellectual self-defense presentation, The Line of Reason, where we're going to be looking at exactly where reason starts and where reason stops. So before we get into that, let's do a very quick recap of part 1 when we talked about the 4 circuits, because this, remember, part 1 is the framework, the board game, or the game board, the playing field for how we're going to be moving forward into parts 2 and parts 3. So the 4 circuits were 1, the physical circuit, the survival circuit, which exists on a dimension of approach and retreat. Circuit number 2, which is the emotional dominant circuit, which exists on one dimension, which is dominate and submit. This is where win-lose interactions happen. The 3rd circuit has no particular dimension. This is our rational circuit that allows us to use speech and label things and create and destroy dimensions as we need them to discuss whatever we're discussing. And then there's circuit 4, which is the moral or taboo circuit that allows us to conceptualize right and wrong. Again, this is on one dimension. So we have these 4 basic circuits that we use to communicate with each other. And there are 2 core principles to understand when we look at how communication happens with these 4 circuits. The first is that in order for anybody to communicate, they have to be communicating on the same circuit. And then the second principle, which is really the principle that my entire theory of intellectual self-defense hinges on, is that the lower circuit sets the interaction. If you got 2 people on different circuits, or attempting to communicate on different circuits, I'm on circuit 1 and you're on circuit 4, or you're on circuit 2 and I'm on circuit 3, whatever is the lower circuit, that's the actual circuit that the interaction is being engaged with. So when we looked at this in part 1, I gave several examples of, okay, let's compare if this circuit meets that circuit or that circuit meets this circuit. Most of the examples are very, very obvious. For example, like if I'm trying to have a moral discussion and you're shooting me with a gun, I'm on circuit 4 and you're on circuit 1, we're obviously having a first circuit interaction there. There's one interaction between circuits 2 and circuits 3 that I like to call the 3-2 slip that is not easy to identify. And this gets to my definition of sophistry, which I had again in part 1, is the act of appearing to engage with somebody on the 3rd circuit where win-win interactions are possible, when in reality you're engaging on the 2nd circuit, which is win-lose. And the purpose behind this is so someone can dominate somebody else while keeping the other person thinking that they're not in a situation where they're being dominated. I can keep you having a discussion when in reality I'm dominating you, so you never think to defend yourself against the manipulation, against the domination. And again, small point here, when I say 3-2 slip, I really mean 3 or 4-2 slip, because the same thing can happen between the second and the fourth circuit, where I'm trying to have a moral discussion, or I'm pretending to have a moral discussion, and I'm really not doing it right, and I'm actually trying to manipulate you. Same thing can happen between 4 and 2 and 3 and 2. For the sake of simplicity, I just refer to it as the 3-2 slip. Now, as I mentioned, this is a 3-part course. Part 1 was the rules of the game, which was the 4 circuits of human interaction, which we just did a recap on. Today, we're going to be going over the theory of the game, which is where we're really looking at exactly where manipulation starts and stops, and where reason starts. Where exactly is that line between manipulation and reason, which will allow us to start identifying manipulation. We defined a manipulation in part 1, but I didn't really talk about identifying it. This is going to be, okay, how do we start identifying manipulation? And part 3, the chain of responsibility, was where the goal is to become skilled at the game, which is to really, really, really speed up that ability to identify manipulation. So let's get into part 2, the line of reason. So, as I said, where exactly is the line between Circuit 3, which is win-win, and Circuit 2, which is win-lose? Now, we talked about this in part 1. Circuit 3 is governed by the rules of logic and really requires honesty and humility to engage in. And I think this intuitively makes sense, where if we're having an honest discussion and I give bad reasoning and you point it out, I need to have the humility and the honesty to say, yeah, you know what? You're right. That wasn't good reasoning. I need to now change my mind because my reasoning was bad. Versus Circuit 2, win-lose interactions, this is governed by power, status, hierarchy, pecking order. This has nothing to do with convincing you that I've got a good argument for why you should be doing something. This is all about you do as I say because I'm in charge. So where does one stop and the other start? Now, we talked about the syllogism in part 1, but we didn't really get into the components of how the syllogism really functions. And in order for us to really understand how that syllogism works, we're going to have to look at formal logic. Now, remember I said at the beginning of part 1, my goal here is not to teach you formal logic. This is not a formal logic class. Formal logic's great. It's a great supplement to what you'll be learning here. My criticism with formal logic is the way that it's presented. When you take a formal logic class, it's all about, okay, here's how you build an argument. Here's how you identify a fallacy. Here's how to analyze whether or not a fallacy is coming toward you, but they never teach you what to do with it once you've identified the fallacy. And in my experience, because my whole journey started with getting into formal logic. My whole journey of intellectual self-defense started on getting in on formal logic. And what I realized is that when people get into formal logic, they get really, really hyped up on naming the fallacy. Here are all the fallacies, and the whole point is, how can you identify when somebody is hitting you with the fallacy? Which is very important. That's identification. However, what I noticed is that if you point out that somebody's committing a fallacy, they usually don't care. I mean, go back to the slide. Circuit 3 is governed by logic, with fallacies, and honesty and humility. If the other person doesn't have honesty and humility, and you point out that they've committed a fallacy, they don't care. Hey, you're manipulating me. Yup. That's what I'm doing. Right? And within, I should say, the internet community that was also getting interested in formal logic, because I was a member of a group getting interested in it, but I was on the, watching other people get interested in this. There was a lot of effort to, you got to name the fallacy and point out when somebody says the fallacy, and I'm pointing out nobody cares. Nobody cares if you name the fallacy unless they're interested in being reasonable in the first place. And if they're really sneaky, if they're really good at being a sophist, man, they'll flip that on you so fast that they'll have you convinced that you're committing the fallacy and everybody watching you that you're the one committing the fallacy. So, while we're going to be looking at formal logic here, I'm going to be looking at it at a completely different angle. I'm looking at it from the angle of, okay, now that you've spotted the fallacy, what do you do? Right? How do we speed up spotting that fallacy, and what do we do once we've figured out that fallacy? So, but we need to have some level of understanding of formal logic in order to grasp this to begin with. So again, I'm not criticizing formal logic. I'm criticizing the way that it's typically presented. So what I'm going to be presenting here is my distillation of formal logic. And I do recommend further study, like knowing the fallacies and being familiar with the fallacies and taking a formal logic class. That's all great. And it's going to be even better if you know this first. So my goal here is to provide a functional understanding quickly, a functional understanding of formal logic quickly. This isn't going to take a month. This is going to take an hour or two. And this is a non-academic approach here. If you've already listened to part 1, you probably figured out that this isn't really an academic approach. Now, what's the source? What's the source of where I got this from? This is the source called The Trivium by a woman named Sister Miriam Joseph. I believe she wrote this in the 30s, called The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric. I do not necessarily recommend reading this book. It is brutal. Per my warning at the beginning that logic is inherently dry, don't go into this expecting anything less than like a medieval style of torture. You got to be on your game to understand this. So if you don't turn around and buy The Trivium after this, don't feel bad. If you're a super nerd into this sort of stuff, go ahead and buy it, but rely on my distillation if you don't want to go through that pain and agony. So here's the warning emphasizing this, right? So formal logic is incredibly dry. Side effects may include falling asleep, daydreaming, earning the label nerd, wishing you were somewhere else, regretting your decision to be here, not getting invited to parties, the inability to get laid, and suddenly realizing that you need to clean up your house right now. Please consult your inner sense of joy before consuming formal logic. So this is just an emphasis on what I said before. This is dry, and I'm going to be doing my best to make it as entertaining as possible because I think it is incumbent on somebody teaching something to make it interesting and to make it engaging. Because if you can't make it interesting and you can't make it engaging, are you really teaching it if you know that someone is going to have a hard time listening to it? So let's get into what is the trivium, right? So going back to the cover of this book, it says The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric. Now, this isn't in the right order. It should say Grammar, Logic, and Rhetoric, but we'll let that slide. So grammar is the same way you could also say knowledge. This is individual observations and the components of that observation, right? I am observing that there is a light shining into my eyes right now. That's the full observation. The components are eyes. The components are light. The components are time. It's happening right now. Logic can also be understood as understanding. This is recognizing patterns from the individual observations. Wisdom is being able to relate that understanding to others. Now, the book, The Trivium, talks about grammar, logic, and rhetoric. We can also refer to this as knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, or even the first two, we can even refer to them as evidence and reason. For part 2, I'm going to be focusing on grammar and logic. Rhetoric, or wisdom, it's really a different animal from the first two, and I guess I should just let this presentation stand by itself, and you can decide whether or not you feel that it's wise. So, I want to start this conversation on the Trivium by saying that when people say logic, what they really mean is grammar and logic. There's a difference between these two. And this is going to be a very unorthodox presentation on logic because I am going to be focusing on grammar. Now, again, don't fall asleep. It's not what you think it is. Don't start having middle school nightmares on me on grammar tests, right? It's just going to be something different. I promise it'll be exciting. I'll try to make it exciting. So if the starting point is grammar here, I even put the God, it's escaping me. Conjunction, junction. What's your function? Schoolhouse Rock. That's it. Image right here on grammar. So yes, don't fall asleep. And here's the difference between what you learned in school and what I'm going to be teaching today. There's a difference between general grammar and special grammar. Special grammar is what we learned in school. This is the grammar of specifically how the language that we're speaking works. English has English grammar. Spanish has Spanish grammar. Japanese has Japanese grammar. That's all special grammar. General grammar is the tool for which we make basic observations, that we create ideas, and that we express knowledge. And the fundamental unit of grammar is the term, and the completed unit of grammar is the sentence. The sentence, of course, would be a full observation. The terms are going to be the components of that sentence. Now, again, the source of this is Sister Miriam Joseph's book on the trivium, and I'm repeating when I say the fundamental unit of grammar is the term. She then goes on to define the term as different from the word. Now, I felt that it was a little metaphysically awkward, and for the sake of just like getting good enough and moving on, the term and the word are close enough to each other when I'm going to call them the same thing, and we're going to say, okay, no, the fundamental unit of grammar is the word. Now, a word has two components. There's a subjective, or I guess I have number one, there's an objective component of a word, and there's a subjective component of a word, and I'm going to be looking at three sentences, which I stole from the book, to emphasize this point. The first one is, Jane married a man. The second one is, man is a monosyllable, and the third one is, man is a noun. Now, if we look at this first sentence, Jane married a man. In order for us to understand what this sentence means, we have to understand what a man is. Jane did not marry a house. She did not marry a frog. She did not marry a car. She married a man. This sentence exemplifies the objective nature of words. The word man is referring to a real thing. Now, the second sentence, man is a monosyllable. I forgot to say that Sister Miriam Joseph calls this the first imposition. You don't need to remember anything about these impositions. I'm just use it now to differentiate, right? This is called the first imposition. Now, man is a monosyllable. This is interesting because in sentence 2, we do not need to know what a man is to understand the sentence, because monosyllable is referring to the phonetic symbol that we use to describe the objective object, which is the sound man. And this could have, in any different language, this could have any different phonetic symbol in order to describe the objective thing, which is the same in all languages. She calls this the zeroth imposition. And strangely enough, she starts with 1 and then goes to 0. So I'm doing the same thing to keep up a tradition. But yes, I did notice that it's weird that we have a zeroth imposition and then we started with 1 and then went to 0. The third sentence, man is a noun. We need to understand both the phonetic symbol and the objective thing that the phonetic symbol is referring to in order to understand the sentence. This is an example of the second imposition. And grammar is the science of the second imposition. Or, to put less dry, right? Grammar is how we identify and relate objective things and objective concepts with their subjective labels and bring them together. This gives us the first layer, the first line of defense for intellectual self-defense, or the first aspect of intellectual self-defense, which is that speech implies reality. Speech implies reality. The fact that you are speaking is alluding to the fact that there is a real thing to speak about. If I say wuga or I say mrzbda, These are sounds that I might be able to spell out phonetically, but there is no objective thing that those sounds are referring to. It becomes a word when I use a subjective phonetic symbol in order to refer to an objective thing. So we're going to be revisiting this in part 3. But just as a bonus in part 2, anytime anybody tries to convince you that there's no such thing as reality, but they're using words in order to do it, to refer to something objective, it's a self-defeating proposition. So this is the first defense against manipulation, is recognizing the fact that speech in and of itself implies reality. Now, this is how I visualize this. And so I've got a shell with a core that I found this online. I'm super sorry that there appears to be like AI sperm trying to get into this shell. But if we've got a shell with a core, the objective component of the word is like the core, and the subjective component, the phonetic symbol, is like the shell going around the core. So we can keep the subjective component, or keep the sound of the word, and remove the objective component and put in something different to get different meanings for the same phonetic symbol. This is called a synonym. I'm familiar with that. But the implications are going to be dire in a way that you probably haven't thought about before. So, yeah, again, this is just a visual to help aid in understanding the difference between the subjective component and the objective component of a word. Now, as I mentioned before, grammar is not just a torture session at school. We use grammar to formulate sentences which are full thoughts, observations, or ideas. Now, here's the boring middle school English class stuff. I'm going to skip over it really fast. A sentence is essentially a subject, a verb, and potentially some other stuff. Right? I'm not going to bore you with the parts of speech here, but at the very least, we need a subject and we need a verb to form a basic, complete idea. Now, we use grammar to effectively and accurately communicate the thoughts that we have. So, for example, we're going to climb Mount Pilchuck. I'm the only person on Earth who doesn't like avocados. Did you see that unicorn driving the Subaru? With all 3 of these sentences, you understood what I meant. I was able to communicate an idea. If I say we're going to climb Mount Pilchuck, now maybe you don't even know where Mount Pilchuck is or what it looks like, but you already know enough with the words to know Dylan's referring to climbing some mountain, and he's referring to climbing a mountain that he's familiar with. With I'm the only person on Earth who doesn't like avocados, now this isn't technically true. I have met one other person in my life who didn't like avocados, but other than that, between me and that one girl that I met, I might be the only person on Earth that doesn't like avocados. They look like snot, they got the texture of snot, and they taste terrible. I don't get what the hype is about it. But you understand what I mean, exactly what I mean when I say I'm the only person on Earth who doesn't like avocados. I'm communicating objective ideas. Now, did you see the unicorn driving the Subaru? This one gets kind of weird because unicorns don't exist. But even so, I still communicated an objective idea, and you understood exactly what I meant when I communicated that idea. Now, we were discussing grammar. We've got the basic unit of grammar, which is the word or the term, and the completed unit of grammar, which is the sentence. We put together an entire sentence, which is an observation or a thought or an idea. We haven't gotten to logic yet. The leap of logic is what we touched base on in part 1, which is the syllogism. So I'm bringing up the syllogism that we brought up before. We've got Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is immortal. We've got the A is to B is to C, therefore A is to C. That, again, this should be review from part 1. And we pointed out that this is a syllogism, which, if I remember correctly, that literally means like to bring together ideas, where we make 2 observations, and from those 2 observations, if there's a common term between the 2, for this in this example, Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, the common term is man or men, we can extract a third piece, which is called reason or understanding, that we weren't able to directly observe from the first two observations, and we could turn around and use that reason or understanding to go out and further understand the universe or the world that we live in. This is the fundamental unit of logic. The syllogism is the fundamental unit of logic. So that begs the question, well, what's the completed unit of logic? Well, it is the argument. The argument can be as small as a syllogism. So, for example, the Socrates is a man syllogism here. This in itself is an argument. But an argument has no size limit, right? I could write books and books and books and books and books to try to make an argument. In fact, these three presentations in and of itself, you could say, is an argument. So, fundamentally, if you break it down, an argument is simply a chain or a string of syllogisms. Now, the problem is that nobody actually talks like that, right? Nobody's like making an argument by slowly and painstakingly breaking down lines and lines and lines of syllogisms. So we have to communicate with assumptions, right? So to give an example of this, if your house is on fire and you're in it, would I ever talk to you like this? Hey, your house is on fire. Fire will kill you. We've got a common term here that allows us to extract a third piece of reasoning, which is, therefore, if you want to live, you should leave your house. Or would I just say, or scream at you, your house is on fire, and I figure that you have enough sense to realize that there's a syllogism in there that makes sense and an argument to be made, and that you can extract the fact yourself that you need to get out of that house or you're going to burn to death. So it's important to point out that reasoning is difficult. There are fundamental assumptions that we have to make, or we would never be able to get to discussing anything. And we always got to be asking ourselves, what are those correct assumptions? Now, to make matters even more difficult, on one hand, we have to have an argument that fundamentally breaks down into a string of syllogisms. On the other hand, no one has time to talk like that. And if we zoom in on the fact that one small error in a syllogism can nullify the entire argument. If I got books and books and books and books and books and books and books to put forth an argument, and way at the beginning, I got a piece that doesn't make sense, that the entire rest of the argument hinges, or the entire rest of the argument, or the list of books hinges on, then everything after the fact becomes an error, becomes wrong. This error in a syllogism we call a fallacy. And again, if you take formal logic, there's going to be a lot of emphasis put on fallacies. So when we're talking from the form of intellectual self-defense, again, this is the more traditional approach, is if you can spot the fallacy, it destroys the argument. Again, there's some nuance to this, and I want to address that here in a little bit. If you can spot the fallacy, it destroys the argument. Now, there are two ways to, there are fundamentally two different types of fallacies. The first one is going to be exemplified here. I'm going to modify the Socrates is a man fallacy slightly. So we got three sentences here. The first one is Socrates is a man. Second one is all men are mortal. So far, nothing is different. And then the third one, I extracted, therefore, Socrates is immortal. This is a logical fallacy because if we break down the syllogism in the multiplying fraction style that we did in part 1, where we have A is to B as B is to C, we end up here, therefore, A is to D. Right? We've got four terms within these three sentences, and the third sentence does not follow from the first two. This is a form of a logical fallacy, and a logical fallacy is how you somehow screw up that syllogism. There's a second type of fallacy. Let's look at this one. Sentence number 1, Socrates is a man. Sentence number 2, all men are immortal. Sentence number 3, Socrates is immortal. This gets interesting. Because if we look A is to B, or if we do the A, B, C thing, this actually checks out. Socrates is A, man is B, Immortal is C. A is to B is to C. Therefore, A is to C. This is a valid syllogism. So where's the fallacy? Where's the error? It's a grammatical error. No one's made the observation that all men are immortal. Now, there's not a million, but it feels like there's a million different ways to screw up the syllogism, whether it's logical or whether it's grammatical. I've got several examples here. Some of them you're probably, even if you're never taken a formal logic course, you probably even heard these terms. A straw man fallacy, a red herring fallacy, a slippery slope fallacy. Begging the question, ad hominem. I think there's something on the order of like 190 different fallacies that have been individually identified. The point that I want to make here is that instead of focusing on how do I memorize and remember all these different fallacies so I could spot them, if we go back to the basics and say, okay, there's two types of fallacies. There's grammatical, and then there's logical. The actual name of the fallacy becomes less important. We just need to find somewhere that the syllogism is broken. Now, in the logical fallacy, that's easier. And the argument that I'm making is that in the grammatical fallacy, it's harder. My argument, I believe this is true, is that typically grammatical fallacies are harder to spot than logical ones. So, when we talk about where's the line, we could have garnered this from part one, that it is indeed the syllogism, but we didn't break down the syllogism enough, because if I just say it's the syllogism, then we would have fallen for the grammatical fallacy, because syllogism checks out. This must be reasonable, right? No, it's a little more in depth than that. And you've probably noticed that I've got the picture of a prism here that I've been using throughout. The reason I have the prism and a white light going and being refracted into the rainbow with the prism, because I think this is a perfect symbol of this. If we say that the white light is a metaphor for circuit 2, something very basic, it's either white or it's black, it's either win or it's lose, that when we're able to get to the third circuit, we now have this full array of colors, how we can discuss and debate things and come to win-win interactions. The line is exactly the spot where that white line refracts and becomes a rainbow. I'm thinking if there's anything I want to add before getting into the next spot, because I am going to take a little bit more time to really dive down and understand from a grammatical standpoint how to more generally understand spotting a fallacy. Again, there's nothing wrong with learning all the different names of the different fallacies. It can be a great tool to helping you. But what I want to teach you are the principles behind how you come up with those different types of fallacies. And once you understand those principles, naming the actual fallacy actually becomes less important. But before I get into that, there's something really important to address here, is the situation so black and white? Because what I've essentially said is that anytime anybody commits a fallacy at any point, they've dropped to the second circuit, they've become unreasonable, and they've started a fight. Is that really the case? Yeah. So the first thing I have on the slide here is if a fallacy is the same thing as being illogical, which is the same thing as being irrational, is that the end of the story? The answer is no. This is actually a false dichotomy, and I want to spend a second here getting into this because it's really important to understand, I mean, for you too, that just because someone commits a fallacy doesn't mean you should come down on them like the hammer of God, because you recognize that you're having a fight. Making an argument is difficult. And no one's ever going to be perfect at making an argument. Everybody's going to commit fallacies. I probably commit one or two myself in this presentation, right? Like I said before, having a discussion, being on the third or fourth circuit, implies humility, which implies that you are going to make errors. Now, when errors occur, does this automatically cause a 3-2 slip? I'm saying here no, And in order for us to have an understanding, when we decide that we've gone over that bridge and we've actually entered Circuit 2, we need a rational method for handling when a fallacy comes to us. And I call this the gentleman's rules of a discussion. I've got a picture here of, looks like it's from like the 1920s of guys boxing. I Googled gentleman's boxing and I searched for the images, and this is what came up. So in the gentleman's rules, we need to recognize that when you're having a discussion, you will make errors, you will make fallacies, even if you intend not to. And we also need to acknowledge that it is incumbent on the other person to point them out if you're wrong. Like, if I honestly want to have a discussion, I honestly want you to point out my mistakes. Because if I want to convince you utilizing proper reasoning, then I need actual proper reasoning, right? If I don't have actually proper reasoning, then I'm not convincing you with proper reasoning. I'm doing a 3-2 slip. So the gentleman's approach or the gentleman's goal should always be, if the other person commits a fallacy, how do we, and starts to slide into Circuit 2, how do we bring them back into Circuit 3? So what are those rules? This is what I think the rules are. This is pretty simple. So in a discussion, if a fallacy is spotted and called out, there are really 3 ways to respond. The first is the person who has the fallacy called out admits his error and then adjusts his argument accordingly. There's a potential that the error doesn't destroy the whole argument. He might just have to adjust it a little bit. The second option is that the person admits his error once the fallacy has been pointed out and concedes that his argument's invalid, and thus changes his mind due to the better reasoning that the other person has given. The third is that person B points out the fallacy and person A says, no, wait a minute. This is valid. There is no fallacy here. Let me explain it in a certain way so you can see that more clearly. And then at that point, the script flips, and then person B now has the 3 options presented to himself, where he could say, you know what, yeah, you're right. I do see it more clearly now, or, oh, hey, I need to modify my argument. I still think there's an error, or I can say, the person can then flip it back and say, no, wait a minute. I think I was right with the initial fallacy, and here's where I think it is. And in theory, this ping pong could go back and forth forever, while there's still this claim of fallacy on the table. We're still operating on the Third Circuit because we're following the, in quotes, gentleman's rules. Now, I do want to point this out. I mentioned this before, which is just because you point out a fallacy on somebody doesn't mean that their argument's wrong. There's such a thing as irrelevant fallacies, which is essentially to focus on an error which is unimportant to the actual argument. And I have an example for this. This is the electric fence story. So, in my family, on my mother's side, there's a family farm. My immigrant great-grandfather came to America in 1908 or whatever the heck it was, and at some point ended up buying like 65 acres of a farm. And he had 4 children. My grandma was one of them. And as time progressed, my great-grandfather became old. He died, and no one was really farming on the farm. They decided to rent out the pasture area to someone who had some horses. And my great-uncle was telling me the story that and I don't know anything about keeping horses, so don't judge me on that. But according to my uncle, this guy was screwing everything up about how to keep horses. And one of the things that he screwed up was the electric fence. So there's an electric fence. The guy sets up this electric fence, and apparently after he sets up the electric fence, he had some wire left over, and he pulled up the wire and left it on the ground. Now, apparently that's a big no-no. I mean, from a common sense standpoint, I don't think I'd do that. But from a farming standpoint, I'm not entirely sure of the magnitude of that sin, but the way that my uncle was making it out to be is that was a pretty big sin. So he goes to the guy and says, hey, what are you doing? You've left 20 feet of electric fence spooled up on the ground here. And the guy's response was, no, I didn't. It's 10 feet. Now, my uncle was on top of this, which he said, the important part of that sentence wasn't 20 feet. The important part of that sentence was on the ground. Right? I just made up a number for the number of feet. The important part of the sentence was on the ground. Now, I think everybody's had this sort of experience where you try to have a discussion, and I mean, sometimes I even make up a number because you're not trying to analyze the literal number. You're trying to make a point, and you're using the magnitude of the number to emphasize that point, and they'll start picking on you, dissecting the number. The point's not about the number. The point is about this other thing I'm talking about. So, it's really infuriating to me when somebody does this, and I think I've come up with a perfect response when somebody does this, which is you look at them straight on and you just say, you understood exactly what I meant and exactly what was important in that sentence. 99% of the time, they'll go, yeah, I did. I was bullshitting you. I know. In the small numbers of time that they still try to stick to their guns, this is the follow-up that you say after that. Well, either you understood exactly what I've said and you're intentionally being deceptive, or you're stupid. Which one is it? I've never had anyone make it past that. But I do want to point out here, there's such a thing as a fallacy that doesn't matter in an argument, right? You could say, okay, that's a grammatical fallacy. There was 10 feet on the ground instead of 20 feet. Doesn't matter. The important point was on the ground. Now, I also want to talk about the concept of polarizing a spectrum. Because, again, when I speak about intellectual self-defense, I speak about sophistry, I speak about manipulation, I have a tendency to speak about it in very black and white terms. And when I've discussed this in private with people before, they've actually come back to me and they said, Dylan, things aren't black and white like you're saying. And I go, I know, but I got to talk about it that way in order to make sense about it, right? So in terms of what I'm doing is called polarizing a spectrum. So I've been using the term sophist, and a sophist is someone who breaks the laws of logic in order to manipulate you, right? Or I should even modify this a little bit. They break the laws of logic while appearing that they're not breaking the laws of logic in order to manipulate you, which would mean a not sophist is someone who uses logic to persuade you. This is completely oversimplified, and this is polarizing a spectrum. There's nobody who ever is like a not sophist. There's nobody who ever 100% follows the laws of logic all the time and never commits any errors, right? This is including myself. Now, on the flip side, everybody listening to this might think of a person or two who is a sophist 100% of the time. There are some people where you're just like, is there anything that comes out of your mouth that isn't a lie or manipulation? I will grant that. But that aside, people fall somewhere on this spectrum at any given time. And it's not possible to analyze, to use this spectrum to measure somebody's sophistry level. Like, here's a little meter that I can stick it from. Boop. Okay, you're a 79% sophist. Boop. You're 19. That doesn't exist, right? In order for us to rationally discuss this topic, we have to speak about this in a polarized way. So what I want you to do when I'm talking about sophistry, when I'm talking about manipulation, when I'm talking about when we're in Circuit 3 or Circuit 2, that there is some gray area, there is some grace here. But I'm speaking about it in a way that it's black and white because that's the most functional way for me to describe this. So please understand that both moving backward from what we've talked about so far, including part 1, and moving forward. Now, another huge pushback that I get when I discuss this is intention. Does intention matter? But Dylan, yeah, he did that, but he didn't mean it. He didn't mean it. We're going to be looking at this in depth on part 3, but I do have to address it here, if only for the fact is usually by the time I get to this point, someone's like, oh, but what about intention? What about intention? Okay, let's address intention. Yeah, intention is the number one objection that I get to this material. And the question is, does it matter? Absolutely not. I am unequivocally 100% without any hesitation, without any question saying that the person's intention does not matter in this conversation. Whether or not the person intends to manipulate you doesn't change the fact that they are. Does that make sense? Like, whether or not I intended to shoot you doesn't change the fact you now have a bullet wound, right? Now, Yes. So they didn't mean to do it, but they still did it. Right? You still have to deal with the consequences. You still have to deal with the result of it happening. Now, intention does matter when it comes to your strategy. How am I going to handle this? If someone's manipulating me and they don't intend to do it, my strategy might be to simply point out what they're doing, and they might go, oh, crap, I didn't mean to do that. I'm going to change my behavior, right? Compare this to law. Like, I'm skipping ahead here. Compare this to law. Look at like manslaughter and murder. These are two differentiations which are, the only really difference is intent, right? With murder, I intended to kill you and I acted on it. With manslaughter, it's I didn't intend to kill you, but you're dead anyway, right? I was driving too fast, I was driving recklessly, and I killed you. I didn't actually want to kill you, but I shouldn't have been driving recklessly, so I'm still responsible for the fact that I killed you. That makes sense? So it does change, like in the realm of law, that does change the punishment, which I would presume is because if you committed manslaughter, you're less of a danger to society than had you intentionally committed a murder, because with the manslaughter, theoretically, you didn't want to do it, right? So hopefully with a lighter sentence, you're reformed and you can go back out into society without committing manslaughter again. The point being is that the person's still dead. Right? Whether it was manslaughter or murder, the person is still dead. The result is still there. It still happened. You still have to deal with it. So whether or not it happened and whether or not you have to deal with it does not change with intention. It does change how you may choose to respond to it. So yeah, they didn't mean it, but you still have to deal with it. And then, like I said, this is going to be a big part to revisit in part 3. Our big idea to revisit in part 3. So, going back to grammar, and going back to logic, and going back to the trivia. As I said before, it's my opinion that grammatical fallacies are harder to spot than logical fallacies. And that instead of trying to name the fallacy, which is nothing wrong with it, but just as an idea here, instead of trying to name the fallacy, let's focus on the fundamentals. And I am going to be looking at a specific fallacy, which is the fallacy of equivocation. I believe that this is the most insidious of all the fallacies, and that by looking at this, I'm going to be able to show you a shortcut, a logical shortcut to identifying when a manipulation is happening faster than you otherwise would in trying to name the fallacy. So let's get into this. I'm going to have another syllogism here that we're going to look at. Sentence number 1, feathers are light. Sentence number 2, light is the opposite of darkness. And sentence number 3, therefore, feathers are the opposite of darkness. Well, this is a valid syllogism, right? We have A is to B is B is to C, therefore A is to C. Well, this is so silly it's stupid, right? Where I'm clearly using a synonym, I'm clearly using a phonetic symbol that has the same phonetic symbol between two wildly different objective concepts, right? One is electromagnetic energy and one is a property of matter, like how much mass it has. Totally different and very obvious, very silly example. I'm starting with the silly example so first you can understand the principle, because now we're going to take it somewhere a little bit more difficult to spot. And we're going to be doing it with a pet peeve of mine, which is with the word discipline, right? Before we looked at the word light and to see how the word light could be manipulated to create a grammatical fallacy. I'm going to be looking at the word discipline. And this is a pet peeve for me because this is a word that was used a lot when I was a kid for what I would argue were many, many, many 3-2 slips. Let's look at how this word could be abused. So discipline is actually a verb and a noun, right? And the verb and the noun actually, like the meanings are similar, but there is a distinct difference. The verb has a meaning, something along the lines of corrective action through punishment. I am going to discipline you, right? We're in the military, you didn't show up to muster on time, so you got to clean toilets at 4 a.m. every morning for a month in order to receive the discipline to make sure that you show up on time in the future. Now the noun to be disciplined doesn't have any connotation of punishment. It has a connotation of willpower. I have the willpower to do unpleasant tasks because I'm disciplined. We can see very clearly that the verb is a Second Circuit concept. To punish somebody implies that I get to dominate them and they have to submit to whatever my form of domination is, whatever the discipline that I decide to mete out is. Totally Second Circuit idea. Whereas if we're just talking about the use of willpower to do unpleasant tasks, we're just, this is just semantics and ideas and information we're throwing around. I'm just describing and making an observation. That's totally Third Circuit. Now, there's also an adjective. And the adjective has a very similar definition to the noun of, I just have the willpower to do unpleasant tasks. And then I just realized I was saying the adjective earlier when I'm comparing the first two. I should have said, I have discipline. There's an example of the noun versus the verb, versus the adjective, I am disciplined. So the verb very clearly denotes a Second Circuit interaction. Whereas the noun and the adjective, at least until we have more information about what's going on, we're in the Third Circuit. We're just describing stuff. Now, this is where you're really going to want, if you haven't noticed already, where you're really going to want to have the visual and where this might get a little bit dry. So, I guess it could have gotten dry before with the grammar, but the point I'm making is bear with me here. There's going to be a glowing point at the end of this. So, if we look at the adjective, disciplined, I could say she is disciplined. Punishment is not implied here. The present tense is she is disciplined. If I turn that into the past tense, that becomes she was disciplined. Basic grammar. Now, if I look at the verb, where punishment is implied, I could have a sentence like, her mother disciplined her. And if I turn that into a passive tense, I could write, she was disciplined. So the past tense of the adjective disciplined has the same set of phonetic symbols as the passive tense of the verb, which becomes she was disciplined. We got the same symbols, but a totally different meaning. So let's have an example with this word discipline. Some syllogisms with this word discipline, and see if we could spot the 3-2 slip. So this is going to be two syllogisms right next to each other, 6 sentences. So the first 3 sentences are, number 1, a disciplined person makes their bed every morning. Number 2, I did not make my bed this morning. Therefore, number 3, I am not a disciplined person. Now we're going to take that number 3, that extracted piece of understanding and use that as our observation for sentence 4. So sentence 4, I am not a disciplined person. Sentence 5, people should be disciplined, right? I guess we're kind of entering the Fourth Circuit here. People should be disciplined, which leads to sentence 6, therefore, someone should discipline me. Let's do a circuit analysis on this, on each time the word discipline is used. In sentence number 1, a disciplined person makes their bed every morning. I'd say that's circuit 3. That's just observation. Sentence 2, we didn't use the word. In sentence 3, I am not a disciplined person. Again, this is just the adjective we're using. We're using circuit number 3 still. Number 4, sentence number 4, I am not a disciplined person. We're still circuit number 3. Sentence number 5, people should be disciplined. Are we talking about the verb? Or are we talking about the adjective? We don't know. We don't know if this is circuit 2 or circuit 3, but we do know on sentence 6, therefore someone should discipline me. That's a verb. We have now entered circuit 2. On sentence 5, we have the ambiguity between the two meanings, right? Now, when we looked at the word light for two different meanings, right, where light is on one hand can describe electromagnetic energy, and on the other hand can describe not having very much mass as a property of the entity, right? that these are wildly different ideas that makes it obvious that we're using two different words even though they have the same phonetic symbol. When you have something like a word discipline, both the verb and the noun and the adjective, while when I broke them down clearly, had a very, very different meaning, they're still kind of interrelated. And if you weren't on top of it with the meanings of these words, you might not catch what just happened in these 6 sentences where we went to circuit 3 and then something happened and we're in circuit 2. That is the 3-2 slip right there. This is the line. This is exactly the line. When I'm talking about the line of reason, where does reason stop and where does manipulation start? This is this is an example that exactly points it out where we've crossed that line in sentence 5. In sentence 5, we don't know what we're talking. What definition of the word discipline are we using? But by the time we get to sentence 6, we know. And then here's the point that I want to make. Now we're talking about, so far this is kind of like standard formal logic sort of thing. This is where Dylan's value comes to the conversation, right? I'm saying you do not need to understand the totality of the logic. You do not need to understand the totality of the syllogisms. You don't have to name the fallacy in order to see what's going on here. You don't even have to read all 6 sentences. You only need 2. If I start with sentence 1, and I know it's circuit 3, and I end on the final sentence, in this case sentence 6, and it's circuit 2, I don't care what happened in the middle. What's the fallacy? Who cares? 3-2 slip has occurred. 3-2 slip has occurred. We started. There was no win-lose interaction. There was no dominate-submit interaction. We ended. It's turned into a dominate-submit interaction. Somewhere in there was a 3-2 slip, and you do not need to care where it was. Now, I spent all this time pointing it out to you to show you that even if we break it down formally, logically, and we spend all this time, okay, we triangulate and get the syllogisms and line them up, and A is B is B, blah, 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 blah. I showed you all that to show you don't need it. I showed you all that to show you that you don't need it. All you need to recognize is, have we gone from circuit 3 or 4 to circuit 2? If that has occurred, sophistry is being engaged in, you are being actively manipulated, you are in a fight, and my argument is you need to respond accordingly. This goes back to part 1. Is that if you can identify this, you need to stop being reasonable. If you continue thinking that you're having a discussion after identifying this, you're being an idiot. You are losing by default. You are groveling on the floor in front of a weak coward who is getting off on making fun of you, who's getting off on dominating you for nothing. You're letting them dominate you for nothing if you argue the points. If you can identify the 3-2 slip, you now have my permission to stop arguing and start fighting. And my distillation of formal logic here, the whole point that I want to make here is that as we zoom in to where the line of reason is my critique of formal logic. They spend too much time talking about stuff that doesn't matter. What matters about logic is that you can identify, at least in terms of intellectual self-defense. There's another, if I want to very exquisitely build an argument, you want to understand how to build and really utilize logic and formal logic and avoid fallacies, that sort of thing. I'm talking about intellectual self-defense. In terms of intellectual self-defense, it's a waste of time to comprehensively and academically focus on, here's all the different fallacies and whatever. All you need to see, did we start at circuit 3 and did we end at circuit 2? Does not matter what happened in the middle. Let's look at another example. My friend of mine brought this one up to me when I was discussing this. The word regulated. Sentence 1. The Second Amendment calls for a well-regulated militia. Sentence 2. It's Congress's job to regulate. Sentence 3. Therefore, Congress should regulate the Second Amendment. Is this a 3-2 slip? I mean, for people who are anti-gun or pro-gun control, this is a very common argument. It's a valid syllogism from a logical standpoint. I mean, it passes the logical syllogism check. Let me say it that way. Is it a fallacy? Well, regulated, in terms of the way that the Second Amendment was written, I don't have it in front of me, but well-regulated militia is like vital to the security of a nation, or whatever it says in there. Regulated means trained. A well-trained militia is what the word means in that context. So the Minutemen know where the cannons are, and they practice on a regular basis, and they know the terrain. So if somebody rings the bell and the British are coming, we know where to line up and have our weapons ready to defend ourselves. We're well regulated. What's the root word of regulated? Regular. We regularly train, right? Now, in the sense of Congress's job to regulate, what does that mean? Well, it means to pass laws. And what do laws imply? There's a correct answer to this. What do laws imply? Laws imply obedience. Obedience is clearly a Second Circuit concept. And particularly with law, we require obedience, and we're going to discipline you, we're going to punish you if you don't follow the law. So the same thing here, I was able to do it in 3 sentences instead of 6, is we start with Circuit 3. Did I have no, I didn't have the circuits broken down on the side. We start with Circuit 3. In the middle, we're going, which one is it? Actually, no, in the middle, it's not even a... we don't even have the grammatical ambiguity that we had in the example of discipline. When we say it's Congress's job to regulate, that's just a completely different meaning. We know what meaning that is. So, again, here's a line. Here's a 3-2 slip. We started with a certain meaning of a word, and we ended with a different meaning of a word with the same phonetic symbol. Started with Circuit 3, ended at Circuit 2, 3-2 slip, not a valid argument. You're having a fight. Let's look at one more example, realistic. This actually came up, and to the person who brought this up, I'm sorry I keep picking on you. I changed your name for the example, but it was just too good. It was just too good of an example. I had to run with it. So this comes about being what it means to be realistic. And when I was presenting this to a group, and there was some teenagers in there, a brother and a sister, and we were talking about the 3-2 slip. I talked about, presented part 1, and this term of realistic came up, and the girl said, well, in something like that, my mom would always tell me that I needed to be realistic. And I went, oh my God, what a great example. Hey, I want to do X. Well, you need to be realistic. What does that mean? Let's see how you can manipulate someone with that. So Samantha, which is not a real name, I had given her the Minecraft idea. I was going through the exercise of imagine something in Minecraft and imagine something in reality, right? So Samantha pointed out that in Minecraft, she really likes to build glass towers with lava waterfalls. Cool. I would want to help participate in building that in Minecraft. Now, if we take that to the real world, building a glass tower with a lava waterfall, is that realistic, right? So Samantha wants to build a real glass tower with a lava waterfall. Sentence 1. Sentence 2. Building a glass tower with a lava waterfall isn't realistic. Therefore, Samantha's not being realistic. Sentence 4. Samantha isn't being realistic when she wants to build a glass tower with a lava waterfall. Number 5. People shouldn't do things that aren't realistic. Sentence 6. Therefore, Samantha shouldn't build a glass tower with a lava waterfall. Now, in this example, this one's a little more slimy. This one's a little more vague. Because it's not so much that the word realistic changes its definition. It's just that it's never defined. What does realistic mean? Realistic comes from the word real. Real is a Greek word that just means like things, like stuff. as it exists in objective reality. I don't even know how to use the word without like using it to define itself. It's so basic, right? Is that real is stuff that actually exists. So when we're using the word realistic, that means, well, it can't actually exist. Yeah, what's realistic mean here? And so, at the risk of pissing everybody off on the more controversial, argumentative, 3-2 slip causing person on the face of the planet right now, I want to bring up Donald Trump. So I read The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump. And I know he had a ghostwriter that wrote it or whatever. That's not the point. That is a perfect example. If I want to talk about The Art of the Deal and someone wants to bring up the fact that he had a ghostwriter write The Art of the Deal, is a perfect example of a fallacy, of a grammatical error that is completely irrelevant. I don't care about his writing style. I care about what was discussed, describing the things that he did in his life, which is what he talked about in the book, or what the ghostwriter wrote that he talked about in the book. Excuse me. And I want to talk about how Trump built the Trump Tower. I was so impressed with this. So Trump describes in the book, through his ghostwriter, that he had this idea to build a skyscraper, a tower, and that he had an idea of where to put it. And where he wanted to put it, and I guess where he ultimately ended up putting it, had a bunch of, I think, remembering the book was a while ago, residential housing. So in order to even have the property to get that, to even have a place to put the tower, he needed all that property. It belonged to 100 or 1,000 or I don't know how many different people. And so what he did was he went and he started getting options on the property. Because there's a dilemma here of, well, if I just start buying all these properties, I actually have to buy them all in order to get what I want. So let's say I buy half of them, I spent all this money on all these different properties, and I still don't get what I want on all this money. He bought options. If you don't know what an option is the right to purchase the property at some point in the future. So I can go to a homeowner and say, hey, I'll pay you for the right to buy your house at some point in the future. I'll pay you $1,000, and I might never buy the house, and you just get to keep the $1,000. Or at some point in the future, I come and I say, hey, I'm going to buy the house at the price that we agreed upon, and I have the right to exercise that option. He went and started collecting all these options around the zone that he needed to own in order to at least have the property to build this skyscraper. And once he got something along the line of 50%, he went to City Hall. He went to the city council and had a map of all the properties, and he had colored in all the different ones that he had gotten an option on so far. And he basically said, well, I would need an option on all the rest of these, and so what I'm asking for is eminent domain. I want the city to use eminent domain so they have to sell me the properties in order to build the tower. Now, this isn't a conversation on eminent domain. Whether you like that or not isn't the point. The point is, so far, has Donald Trump done anything yet that's unrealistic? The answer to that is no, is because he actually did it. It's real, right? So then he gets eminent domain. He's able to get the eminent domain, and he gets all the properties. And then he gets faced with the problem of, I need, and I believe he also got permitting for the tower at the same time. He got faced with this problem of, okay, I need to get financing in order to build this tower for the bank. And I know the bank is not going to give me financing unless they know that I get a property tax break on building this tower. Now, in order for me to get a property tax break, the city is going to want to know that I've got financing to build the damn thing in the first place. Now, I got to say, it's been a while since I read the book. I don't remember how he actually finagled that catch-22, but he did. He did. And he built the tower. Is that unrealistic? Is that unrealistic? No, he did it. It's real, right? So that addresses the glass tower part. Because, I mean, I don't have image of Trump Tower right in front of my brain right now, but it's pretty common that when you build a skyscraper that all the exterior is glass windows, and so that would make it a glass tower, right? So building a glass tower is not unrealistic. Now, what about the lava waterfall? I don't know if you've ever seen this, but I caught it on some social media of these geologists. They can make lava right? They got these big kiln machine instrument things that can they can get in rocks. They can get the thing hot enough that the rocks melt and they can make lava. And, they had this thing where they made the lava, they poured it out, and this lava is slowly going across this, I presume, stone ramp that they had made, and they put a grill over it, and they started grilling steaks on top of this lava flow, which is pretty funny. But the point that I wanted to make is there is technology available to build a lava waterfall. I mean, I guess you call it a lava fall, right? It's not a lava waterfall, but you get what I'm saying. Now, would it be unrealistic if you had Trump Tower, and you might want to do this on the bottom floor where there's concrete, but would it be unrealistic to rent it out to a geology experimentation laboratory company that makes lava waterfalls in the tower? Oh, you could do that. That's totally not. I don't see that's unrealistic. Now, I'm not saying that the girl in this example should build a tower and should put a lava waterfall in there. What I'm saying is there's no part of the story that's unrealistic. So in this case, and then maybe the mom will be mad at me for teaching her this, but all these times the word realistic is never defined. It's just, I mean, it's like a phonetic symbol with no objective core. You shouldn't do that because that's a bad idea because right? And you can see where this is another example of a 3-2 slip, because I am not giving you a legitimate reason for not doing the thing that you want to do. And I mean, this goes back to the beginning of part 1 where I said, hey, what's in your mind affects your behavior, and what you let in your mind unfiltered is going to change the way that you behave. Well, this is what people do to each other. They drag each other down. I don't want you to do that. I mean, forget the reasons why, but if you have a vision and you want to do it and you don't have a filter for stuff like this, how are you ever going to get it done? If you got a vision, you want to get it done, but you don't have a filter for bullshit, for fallacious arguments, for 3-2 slips, how are you ever going to get that done? You're not. Because is this a Second Circuit interaction? Now, I don't know the example that this girl, a real example that this girl would go to her mom with, where the mom says, basically, I don't want you to do that, and the reason she gives is unrealistic, right? But this is clearly a Second Circuit interaction, where the daughter wants to do X, the mother doesn't want her to do X. There's not a good reason. There's not a Third Circuit or Fourth Circuit reason for why the girl shouldn't do that. So it's a dominance move. It's a Second Circuit interaction. You need to do what I say because of Wiggleman. And as a quick side note here, it's worth pointing out that adjectives aren't arguments. That's what's going on here, is an adjective is being thrown out. You're being selfish. You seem arrogant. That's not very polite. None of these are arguments. Where's the syllogism? Right? If somebody hits you with any of these things, it's just not an argument. And the person that I really appreciate who emphasizes this a lot is Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain. Is his point being that he makes is that when people do this, they're hoping that you self-attack. You're being selfish. Well, is that good? Is that bad? Where's the syllogism that says you're being selfish, selfish is bad, therefore you're bad? I mean, where's the argument that breaks that down? What they're hoping is they get to throw an adjective at you, and then you come up with the syllogism in your head why you're doing something bad and attack yourself with it. So fundamentally, I think all sophistry is lazy behavior, but they're being lazy. They want you to come up with the attack to attack yourself. Yeah. So the reason these aren't arguments is because there is no syllogism. So if you decide to take what I'm saying to heart and start applying it, and I am gonna emphasize this a little bit later here, is that in each of these three examples, I really hyper-focused on one word in the example, right? There's all these words happening on this screen, but there's one here that's really, really important. And what you might find in a sophisticated interaction is that the sophist gets all bent out of shape over the fact that you're getting bent out of shape and there's just one word. Like, look at all these words on the screen. There's all these words on the screen and you're just getting upset about one little word. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is the fact that that's the word on which the whole thing hinges on, right? I mean, what's the big deal about one short in an electric circuit? What's the big deal about one hole in a boat? Because it ruins the whole thing, right? I mean, what I talked about this before is that in order to form an argument, you have to have a chain of syllogisms, and they all have to be good all the way through. If there's one hole, the whole thing breaks after that. With some exceptions, you know, you got the gentleman's rules, and you've got the irrelevant fallacies and that sort of thing. But if we're actually focusing on the pertinent aspects of the argument, one error breaks the whole thing. Just like one short in an electrical circuit, it shorts out one hole in the boat and it sinks. So the reason the sophist is so bent out of shape about it, and the reason that you should be so bent out of shape about it, is because an inch is as good as a mile. Why? The reason is that if you give the sophist an inch, you're not just giving an inch. It's just an inch. Why are you so upset about a little bit of inch? I mean, yeah, sorry I'm getting so hyped up about this. But this reminds me, I didn't mention this in part one. Back at Edward at the table, where the guy came over to humiliate me and all my friends lean in and blame me for starting to fight. It was so long ago, I don't really remember what I responded to it, but I did give them some pushback. And at one point, one of the people at my table said something to the effect of, well, if you don't like him, why don't you move? Well, fuck that. He can move. I mean, like people say such stupid stuff like that, where this is what I'm saying. It's this one, the tiny little thing. Well, the result of that is who gets to move. I was here first. He can move. Right? So what a sophist is doing is if they can get that little inch on you, you have now allowed them to set the precedent that they can take that same inch anytime that they want to in the future. Does that make sense? If you let them take that 1 inch on a concept, that concept is now fair game for any point in the future for them to use over and 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 over again, and then you got to dig yourself out of the hole if you ever want to address it. So, sophists will try to make big things look small. It's just one little word. It's just, why are you so upset about the little inch? But I don't get it. Because that's your foot in the door. Right? That's the wedge. That's where you're going to stick the lever to really get me. So, don't let them. I'm going to describe a technique here in a second. Don't let them do this. This is how I typically deal with a situation like this, where if we're focused on just this one little thing that shouldn't matter in the argument, is focus on it like a heat-seeking missile, like a freaking laser. In example 1, focus on the word discipline. In example 2, focus on the word regulate. In example 3, focus on the word realistic. Focus on it like a laser, and do not let the sophist distract you from it. And they'll try. Because remember, that's what the manipulation is hinging on. If they don't have that, they lose the whole thing. So they're going to try to distract you. Focus on this, focus on that. Let me change the subject. Blah, 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 blah. Like a laser, focus on the word that's causing the problem. And in my experience, at some point they give up. At some point they give up. They may start yelling. I don't think I'm going to tell the story today, but they may start yelling at you. But just be prepared to yell back. I have had this specific thing happen to me before where I really focused on the word. The guy started yelling at me, and I just started yelling back. Now we got to fight. I'm prepared to fight you. Let's go. Any other examples? These are a little more politically charged, and I bring them up for that reason. What about Black Lives Matter? This is a perfect example of where this fallacy of equivocation can come in, where there's the meaning of the words Black Lives Matter, the sentence, and then there's the fact that, or it's a phonetic symbol all of its own, Black Lives Matter TM, right? The organization. Now, what the organization is versus what the sentence means aren't necessarily the same thing. And anybody with half a brain cell can see that they're actually quite opposed to each other. But this is how the propaganda and manipulation gets played onto you, because there's this vagueness on what's the objective meaning behind the phonetic symbol. It's the same thing for MAGA, right? We, on one hand, MAGA can be seen as, let's take all the great things about America and make them great again, where on the other hand, that's been taken to mean, oh, you're talking about colonialism and slavery and white supremacy and all the negative things that America stands for, right? So now, when we say the word MAGA, what does it mean? What does it mean? White supremacy. Same thing. Well, white supremacy, if I look at the and I forgot to say about MAGA. MAGA literally means make America great again, right? That's a sentence. And then there's MAGA, TM, which, I guess Black Lives Matter is like a literal actual organization. MAGA is not. But still, there's kind of a MAGA TM of a brand that represents. Now, let's look at white supremacy. So in white supremacy, this is the literal meaning of the words is the idea that, okay, there's a racial group of white people that think that they're the best, and whatever implications that might have. White supremacy then turns into anybody that we don't like, we're going to call him a white supremacist, right? So Larry Elder runs on the Republican ticket for governor in the state of California. He is the black face of white supremacy. Huh? To someone looking at the actual grammatical meaning of white supremacy, they're like, that doesn't make any sense. I don't get what that means. But if you say, okay, someone else came along and injected a different meaning into that, and white supremacy now means something to the effect of like domestic terrorist, or basically anybody that we disagree with, it's a colonizer. It's someone who agrees with colonization. It doesn't matter what your skin color is. I don't have it up here, but the same thing with racism. Racism means, from the if you look at the grammatical point of the word, it means, okay, I'm discriminating against somebody based on their race or their ethnic group that they belong to. Racism has now turned into what's the new definition of like the existence of power and privilege, and because white people have power and privilege, therefore only white people can be right. I mean, you see what this is. And I'm heavily focusing on this is all fallacy of equivocation. Is that I think this is the most insidious fallacy that there is, because if you're not paying strict attention to what's going on behind the phonetic symbol, the objective thing going on behind the phonetic symbol, it's just so easy to slip from one meaning to the next and get manipulated. Religious differences can actually do this as well. The myriad versions of Christianity are a perfect example of this, where you can have words like salvation and grace and second coming and all these different things, and each denomination can have a wildly different understanding of what those words mean. And I'm going to be giving a few examples in part 3 of how that could be very, very manipulative. So in conclusion, we're coming to the end here in part 2. You should now have a grasp on where the line is, right? Hopefully you have a very, very good grasp on where the line is. And I do recommend further study in formal logic, but I hope you understand what I meant before is that if you understand this, specifically of, I don't need to know the details. I really don't need to know the details to identify when a 3-2 slip has occurred. Now, it doesn't help to know your fallacies, but now you're not reliant on the fallacies, the different types of naming these different types of fallacies to figure out where a 3-2 slip occurred. They can help you, but now they're bolstering the fundamental basics that you've learned from this. Now, this method is a catch-all. If you accurately apply this method, or properly apply this method, you will catch any and all fallacies. It doesn't mean it's easy. But if you take the time and sit back and say, okay, let's break it down syllogistically and grammatically like this, this will catch everything. I emphasize that because part 3 won't necessarily catch everything. However, it's slow. Now, I showed you the way that I tried to speed it up, where I say, hey, look, I don't care what happened in the middle. I can see the beginning, I can see the end, and I see somewhere in the middle we've got a 3-2 slip, so I don't care. But even then, it's still a bit slow. Now, if you're going to use this and speed it up as much as you can, there's some gut instincts to have. The first is, if you feel like you're backtracking in a conversation, you probably are. Which means you're probably getting manipulated. Identify important words and focus on them, like I did in these 3 examples. And like I said, naming the fallacy is great, but it's not a big deal if you can't. And look for clear signs of someone engaging on the Second Circuit, which is becoming defensive, passive-aggressive, talking down to you, becoming impatient or exasperated. Oh, that's my favorite one. Is if whether disciplined, regulated, realistic, whatever word we're focusing on, if you're like, hey, wait, I want to understand what we're saying when we use this word, and the person's like, oh, you don't understand what the word realistic means. And I got to sit here and deal with this. They probably don't know what it means either. Okay, define it. Define it. Oh, you don't know? Everybody knows what the word means. Yeah, right. Yeah, look out for the exasperated response. And then I just mentioned this one, acting like the meanings of words are obvious, but they won't define them. Chances are you're in 3-2 slip territory. So, we have now completed part 2. And I do, but before we go to this, I do want to emphasize this on the conclusion, because this was the focus of part 1, but it's like I said, it's the framework behind all of this discussion is happening, which is I've been talking about identifying the 3-2 slip here. The big focus here has been on identification. Once you've identified, move out of circuit 3. That's my premise here. You do what you can. You got all these tools that I'm presenting here in order to identify when the manipulation is occurring. Once you've identified, stop circuit 3. Stop being reasonable. You need to engage on circuit 2. Now, there's lots of different ways you can engage on circuit 2. There's lots of different strategies. There's not necessarily a right strategy, like I mentioned at the end of part 1. One of my preferred strategies is to become very confrontational. And people say, well, Dylan, you're just using this thing because you want a reason to become confrontational. You don't always have to be confrontational. Yes, you do not always have to be confrontational. That's my strategy. If you got a better strategy, use it. But the strategy of continuing to be reasonable is the number one way to always lose. You will always lose if you continue being reasonable. So, in part 1, which is complete, we discussed the 4 circuits of human interaction, which was really focusing on defining what manipulation is. In part 2, which is the line of reason, which is what we're completing right now, is really looking at the framework of how we identify the manipulation. And like I said, this is like the catch-all. This is describing everything on how we identify that manipulation. Next, and my favorite part, is we're moving on to part 3, the chain of responsibility. This is where we say, how do we speed up that identification to like warp speed? Once you understand part 3, particularly in reference to part 1, like I said, if you skipped it, you wouldn't be listening to this right now. But if you were to skip part 2, you can make do with parts 1 and parts 3. Part 3 is going to make this so fast and so dynamic that like you're going to be a different person, presuming you take what I said to heart. And my opinion is you're not going to be able to not take it to heart, because once you see this, even listening to part 2, once you've seen this, you're not going to be able to unsee it. And once you realize that you're being dominated and you're submitting, you're going to recognize that you're being cowardly. And are you going to be able to live with yourself knowing that you're being cowardly? I don't think you will. So, next is going to be part 3, the chain of responsibility and how to identify manipulation fast. And this is going to be the first slide of that presentation. So thank you for watching, and I will see you there.